In the previous video, we looked at the events preceding the Peloponnesian Wars like the Battle of Tanagra, the conflict between Megara and Corinth. We also looked at events that had formed part of the backbone of the causes attributed to the starts of a war that would define events in the region for decades and centuries after. We will continue in this episode. Battle of Enophyta. It took place in 457 BC, with the battle at Tanagra preceding it. In the Battle of Tanagra, both sides had lost significant troops, but Sparta had emerged claiming victory. Another conflict would come in the form of the Battle of Enophyta. Enophyta would be a town located in Boeotia. In the aftermath of the battle, Athens would be able to finish building up the long wall, and Boeotia would come to be under them. They would also move on to other areas. Egyptian campaign. The Athenians would make moves to support a rebellion in Egypt which had been a satrapy of the Persian Empire. Inaros would be the individual who would play a large role in the rebellion. He would reach out to the Delian League for support, which would see the Athenian admiral Charitimides, who had been campaigning elsewhere, be redirected towards the conflict. The Athenians would initially win against the Persians, but a reversal in their fortunes would come in time. Athens would be defeated in 454 BC by a man who was a satrap in Syria. He went by the name of Megabyzus. Athens would find itself involved in the wars for several reasons, including interests in trade, and the ability to strike a blow at Persia. Artaxerxes I would be the Persian king at the time, and he would send a force to overcome the revolt. Numerous battles would occur over the period, including the siege of Memphis, the siege of Prosopitis, and the Battle of Mendesium. The year 454 BC would see the Persians achieve a victory over the Athenians. The year would also see the 5 years truce. 448 BC saw the Second Sacred War, which would end with the Spartans triumphant against the Phocians. The victory would afford the Delphians the ability to govern themselves once again. 446 BC. Boeotian Revolt. The 30 Years' Peace would be signed around 446 or 445 BC, and in 440 BC, one of Otane's ally, Samos, would rebel. The Samian War would ensue and end in success for Athens, and Samos' yielding of defeat. The event would see the involvement of Pericles. Several terms would be given to the Samians. During this period, the prospect of war against Athens would be discussed amongst Sparta and its allies, but eventually decided against for several reasons, including the predisposition towards war of some of Sparta's allies and issues surrounding preparedness towards the war. 433 BC. Trade sanctions by Athens would be placed against Megara. Megara was a Spartan ally. 434 BC would see a conflict between Corinth and Corcyra, and a battle known as the Battle of Sybota. The chapter would involve a clash between several states, that would involve members of the Delian League and members of the Peloponnesian League. Involved in it as well would be the states of Epidamnus, Corcyra, Corinth, Athens, and eventually Sparta, in a conflict that would be noted in history as an important and critical event. One full of political considerations. It would change the course of history and change the fate of the world. The epic and important story goes like this. The founding of the city of Epidamnus had involved colonists from Corcyra. This played a role in defining the interpretation of events when the Democrats on Epidamnus approached Corinth seeking aid. Corcyra was a colony of Corinth, and the relationship between it and Corinth was strained. Previous events had stirred a growing resentment and tension within the relationship. When internal conflicts between the oligarchs and the Democrats on Corcyra erupted, and involved matters like a coup that had replaced the oligarchs with the Democrats, other city-states would become involved in the events. A conflict on an island would draw in regional powers. Corinth was one of those states. The Epidamnian Democrats would come to receive promises of assistance from Corinth when they went to seek it, Corinth finding expedient attributes to provide that aid given their relationship to Corcyra, and the previous turns that had occurred within their relationship and the greater context of events. An act which played a role in pushing Corcyra to become involved, which it subsequently did, making demands of its own that would involve the expulsion of the Corinthians from the state. Add into this the greater context of affairs in the region, especially regarding Athens, the Peloponnesian League, the Delian League and Sparta. The actions on Epidamnus would continue to draw in more and more parties to be intermediaries, participants, detractors, advocates and allies in the affairs, and would lead to growing tension. Other members of the Peloponnesian League would come to play a role. Several exchanges between Corcyra and Corinth would result, and at some point in time, Corcyra would threaten with the possibility of seeking Athens' aid and therefore involving the powerful city-state which had more resources behind it. Again, several interactions would occur between Corinth and Corcyra, seeking a resolution to affairs that was peaceful, with the involvement of Sparta. But war would eventually find itself declared on the side of the Corinthians. The conflict would involve the Corcyrians and the Corinthians. Corinth would develop itself into more of a naval authority. Athens would find itself called into agreeing to aid the Corcyrians if they were attacked, which was different from absolute support. Several considerations would be made in the Athenians' decision to offer this aid, including opinions about the balance in naval strength within the region. Enter the Battle of Sybota. It occurred around 433 BC, and would see Corinth and Corcyra, as well as some allies involved, and also saw numerous individuals also involved, the likes of Lacedaemonius, and also several ships. An Athenian fleet had been sent with instructions guiding their behavior in the events involved. The arrival of Corinthian ships would cause the Corcyrian ships to prepare, maneuvering into a formation in preparation. Eventually conflict between the two fleets would occur, the end of which saw the Athenians and the Corcyrians turning about in the direction of Corcyria, in order to protect it from attack. The conflict would result in intense fighting between the two fleets, one that initially saw the Athenians mostly uninvolved. But as events unfolded, the war progressing poorly for the Corcyrians, the Athenians would eventually find themselves involved in the fighting. The Corinthians would emerge victorious in the conflicts. In the meantime, more ships from Athens would arrive, and amidst the growing contingent of ships on the Corcyrian side, further conflict would be circumvented and the Corinthians would retreat. A decision that would have some bearing on future events. The Battle of Potidaea in 432 BC would occur soon after, and would see several parties involved, including Archestratus, Callias, and Aristeus, who was a Corinthian general. A siege would also occur that would end up heavily costing Athens financially. During the events occurring at Potidaea, war would be declared in formal terms in a meeting attended by individuals from Corinth, Athens, and Sparta. With growing tensions, this episode would be filled with intense fighting and conflict amidst several demands that had been made by Athens on a member of the Delian League in the form of Potidaea. Events would follow that would lead to a battle. We will explore these events in more detail, looking at what had led to the situation, the individuals involved including Archestratus, and the roles they would play. We will also look at the strategies that were used, and the overall outcomes and consequences of the conflicts. We start with Potidaea itself, which would find itself in an interesting situation linked to how it had started, a colony of Corinth on one side, yet it was a member of the Delian League on the other. It would therefore be the site of tensions that were beyond itself. At a similar time, activities beyond its walls would see revolts in several areas incited and encouraged by the influence of Perdiccas II of Macedon. Athens would make several demands of Potidaea, some of them in relation to Corinth, and the judges that were received by Potidaea. Athens had its reasons for these demands. Nonetheless, Potidaea would see several revolts and Athens would send a fleet. These events would see the involvement of Archestratus. The fleet that was sent originally had a different objective, but they were ordered to Potidaea. The Macedonians that were there would be attacked by the fleet. Other states would also be involved, including Corinth, which had sent some hoplites and troops. Sparta would promise to help the Potidæans. The Athenians would then travel to Potidæa, and a battle would ensue between the large and combined forces present. Fighting with mixed outcomes would occur. Some Corinthian troops would be able to gain victory against some Athenians, but in other areas the Athenians would be able to defeat Corinthian troops. Other conflicts would occur, including some with some of the reserve troops of the Potidæans. Eventually a blockade would be effected by Athens. The siege would also have consequences politically for some of the states involved, including Athens. 432 BC. Some Peloponnesian League members are called to Sparta. A debate occurs. Representatives from Athens are also in attendance of the debate, as well as representatives from Corinth. Several arguments would be made here for several courses of action. Sparta voted to declare that the actions of the Athenians had surmounted to compromising peace. Archidamus II, a Spartan king, would argue against the war. Eventually war would be declared. Several factors had contributed to the eventual escalation to war, including events in Potidæa, and the Megarian decrees. 431 BC. Archidamian War. The Spartans and the Athenians would pursue their own war strategies over the course of the conflicts based on what they perceived to be the weakness of their counterparts, and their own strengths. Sparta would invade land around Athens, whilst Athens on the other hand would use more of their fleet and its strengths against the Spartans. Though the Spartan strategy would still leave the sea still open to Athens. In 430 BC an event would occur that would drastically change the fate of the war, and would contribute to weakening the Athenians. Some of them who had been forced to enter the confines of the long walls due to the Spartan invasion of surrounding land, would be struck by a plague which would greatly reduce the population of the city. Several important individuals would die with the plague, including soldiers, and even Pericles himself. The plague would have an impact on the course and eventual outcomes of the wars. Along with Pericles' death, change was on the verge for the Athenian strategy. Elements would emerge and contribute to a change in strategy, and this would include a man known as Cleon. A man called Demosthenes also would be involved in events during this period. The general period would also be characterized by several events in the Athenian world, including an increase in military activity within several regions, and naval raids that would lead to several victories. These raids would occur within the Peloponnesian region. A post near Pylos would be relevant in this period. The post attracted several helots, the subjugated population in Sparta that Sparta had feared could revolt. Sparta responded to this growing threat by attacking Pylos. Several battles would follow which would be significant for various reasons. In 425 BC the Battle of Pylos would occur. It would end in Athenian victory. On the post would be soldiers, hoplites, and archers, and these would be used to great effect by Demosthenes to defend the post against the army that had come outnumbering it. They would prevent the Spartans from successfully storming Pylos. The Spartans would move to prepare to lay siege, but as they did, a ship arrived with Athenian forces, who overpowered the Spartans, leading to a renowned defeat, and cutting the Spartans from effectively escaping as they remained on an island called Sphacteria. With events unfolding as they did, the Spartan government would be forced into responding. They sent individuals to represent the government of Sparta. Negotiations for lasting peace would occur and would fail. The Athenians would eventually attack the Spartans that were on the island, which led to the Battle of Sphacteria. In the Battle of Sphacteria the Spartans in turn would face the force which was led by Cleon and Demosthenes, after the Athenians had initially tried starving the Spartans, by denying them access to food supplies. Fighting would occur that would result in several casualties. At the end of fighting, however, the Spartans would be overcome. The Battle of Sphacteria would be significant in the course of the wars and in the course of Spartan history as well. With the men being held hostage by the Athenians, the Athenians would make demands of the Spartan government, which also included issues surrounding Attica. Capturing of Amphipolis. Amphipolis is captured by Brasidas, who was a Spartan general. Prior to the event, Brasidas had captured and taken Acanthus, and had played a role in preventing Megara from falling into the hands of the Athenians. Amphipolis had significant economic importance for the surrounding silver mines, and was an Athenian colony. The Athenians in the colony would send for aid, and it would be sent in the form of Thucydides. Thucydides would be exiled. The events that occurred at Amphipolis and his own failure to arrive on time would contribute to this outcome. Amphipolis would surrender before Thucydides could arrive. Several other towns would also be attacked by Brasidas. After the capture of Amphipolis, the Spartans and the Athenians would agree to an armistice which would specify that each party was to remain in the territory that they had gained, both sides having their own hopes of what they would be able to gain from the armistice. The armistice had ended in 422 BC. A battle would occur between Cleon and Brasidas and their troops as Athenian troops attempted to recapture Amphipolis in the Second Battle of Amphipolis. Cleon had been accompanied by hoplites and some cavalry but would have to retreat as he waited for more troops to join his. A retreat that would go poorly for the Athenians, and one that Brasidas would take advantage of to emerge triumphant against the Athenians, though during it Cleon would be killed and Brasidas would be injured severely, dying after victory had been achieved. The deaths would change the situation, and approaches of both the Spartan and the Athenians. The following year would see the signing of the Peace of Nicias. It brought to end fighting. The process would see the involvement of several important individuals, including Pleistoanax, who was a king of Sparta, and Nicias, who was an Athenian general. Through the peace treaty both sides were to regain some territory and other concessions from the other side, but the treaty would eventually be broken. 418 BC. Battle of Mantinea. An important and large battle in Greece which ended in triumph for the Spartans and changed the course of events for Sparta. It also saw Agis II, Pharax, Hipponoides, and Laches involved in the fighting. It was important for the message that it sent. 416 BC. Melos is invaded by Athens, and held to siege until they are forced to surrender amidst Athenian demands that they join the Delian League and pay the Athenians tribute. Melos, as an island, had been neutral in the wars between Athens and Sparta. 415 BC. Sicilian expedition starts. It would end in 413 BC. The Sicilian expedition would end in a decline in the troops and forces available to the Athenians. One individual in particular would claim one of the roles in prominence in the Sicilian expedition. A man called Alcibiades, who had been active within the political world of Athens, a student of Aristotle as well. Alcibiades would be one of the proponents of a more aggressive Athenian approach to the war. 415 to 413 BC would be the period during which the expedition would occur. But the leadership would change at some point, as Alcibiades would be forced back to Athens as he had to stand trial. Early on in the expedition, Syracuse would be enveloped. Gylippus, who was a Spartan general, with his troops would come. Several conflicts would occur, but Athenian defeat would be the outcome of the exchanges. 413 BC. The Second War starts. 412 BC. Persians are active in Ionia. Tissaphernes is involved in supporting the building of a Peloponnesian fleet. Tissaphernes was a Persian satrap. 411 BC. Athenian fleet on island of Samos fights the Spartans in the Battle of Syme. The period from 410 to 406 would see Athens win several conflicts, gaining land as a result. A man named Alcibiades would be relevant to this period in the wars. 408 BC. Darius II is increasingly involved in the wars. Cyrus the Younger, his son, is dispatched. He works together with Lysander, a Spartan general. 406 BC Naval Battle of Notium. The naval battle of Arginusi results in a victory for the Athenians. Fallout from issues that arose from the battle would weaken Athens. 405 BC Battle of Aegispotami sees victory for Sparta. The battle would occur in Hellespont, and would see several key individuals involved including Lysander and Arachus in a conflict that would have a massive impact for the individuals inside the region and for the history itself. At stake was the future of Athens and access to the resources that were needed for Athens to remain fed. Lysander would be heavily involved in events leading up to and the events during the battle. He was a Spartan, born around 454 BC. In 408 BC he would be made into admiral. His interaction with Cyrus would lead to Cyrus financially playing a large and critical role in the wars, which would massively benefit the Spartans, allowing them to undertake activities that would contribute to their eventual victory. His term as admiral would be followed by that of Callicratidas. The end. Lysander would eventually return as vice-admiral, and would receive a massive boost in the form of access to massive resources from Cyrus, which he would put to use with great effect. The end result of the Battle of Aegispotami was a massive loss of naval power for the Athenians, which would hasten their eventual demise and eventually contribute to the outcomes of the Peloponnesian Wars. Several cities would be captured by Lysander's fleet. Surrender from the Athenians would eventually come, as the position they were forced to occupy was a hard one to be in. The 30 Tyrants regime would soon follow. 404 BC End of the wars, Peloponnesian League emerges victorious, surrender by Athens and allies. Sparta would now be the dominant party in the region. 395 to 387 BC would Corinthian War, which again shifts the balance between Athens and Sparta. Thank you for listening to this podcast episode on the important Peloponnesian War, as we looked into the events of the war, the strategies that were used, and the people involved. If you enjoyed this video, be sure to subscribe to the channel for more.